everybody. I am going to talk about chapter 30. I have taken out quite a few images um, because we are getting close to the end, and I feel like we really need to have less images. I know it's a lot of information that we've had this semester. So let's get going. Modernism in the United States. As promised, we've come to this country, and we'll just look at two artists from Mexico as well. So in 1913 is the Armory Show, and I talked a little bit about that in the last chapter. And this is really when Americans got their first taste of European art. And we have artists like Matisse, Kandinsky. Remember, he thought his paintings were like music. Picasso with his Cubism, and Duchamp with his Dadaism. Um, being shown, and many American artists actually show as well. It's about 1,600 pieces of art at this one show that many, many, many Americans flocked to from all over the country to see, what was going on in the art world, because this would be the first time that they would have been introduced to all of this new stuff. Um, and frankly, a lot of Americans weren't ready for it, especially the art critics. For instance, this is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase #2. And we've seen artists like Kandinsky naming paintings after numbers or musical compositions. Um, and remember, Duchamp is the one who creates Dada, the fountain, right? The urinal that he calls art, the ready-mades. So this painting itself, you can see, looks a lot more like Cubism, and it is a painting. So I always often think, well, at least he didn't show the fountain where people would have lost their minds. But really, people hated this painting. People made copies of it and burned it in effigy outside of the Armory Show. It was in all the newspapers. One critic called it was an explosion in a shingle factory. Um, and they just did not want, you know to have this type of art being shown in this country. They weren't ready for it, really. But when you look at all these other names, I don't know that Duchamp should have stood out so much. But he was very much in your face all the time, so he probably enjoyed that kind of criticism, unlike Whistler, who we saw with his own critic problems. But once you open that bottle, you can't put the genie back in. This is the beginning of modern art in this country. Um, and it will take a while for American artists to come to some different understanding about art. They sort of hold on to the way things are for a while. And one thing that happened shortly after this is the Great Depression starts. We have the stock market crash in 1929, um, where all of this sort of thriving enthusiasm for all things art is, you know, put on hold completely. Most museums and galleries stop buying art, um, and the art market nearly disappears. I mean, people just don't have money to invest in art during the Depression. And one thing that does happen, though, is the government creates programs for artists to find work. And so we have the Works Progress Administration and the Federal Art Project working together, who they're paying artists at a regular wage in exchange for work. And a lot of these are giant mural projects in government buildings that artists will make. And a lot of these still are there where they were painted, like in the middle of nowhere on a post office or something. Um, and then we also have a lot of artists coming to this country to escape persecution. A lot of the artists that we looked at in German Expressionism come to this country. Dali comes to this country, de Kooning, who we'll look at in the next chapter. Max Ernst, the surrealist, Mondrian, who does suprematism, we'll look at in the next chapter. They all leave Europe and come to this country. Uh, Unfortunately, a lot of them will go back to their country not feeling very welcome here. Dali will go back to Spain, but some of them will stay and participate in the modernist styles that will develop in this country. Edward Hopper, this is a very famous painting, Nighthawks. It's painted in 1942. Edward Hopper reacts to the Depression. He makes paintings that often show uh, people who are, sort of very contemplative, but sort of isolated, even in the city. Whoops, sorry. It looks like I have two slides here. I don't know how that happened. Um, And so you see this is a famous painting, you've seen it before. These figures, and you can tell they're from the 40s and 50s by their dress, in this sort of bubble, this lit up bubble in the middle of empty streets. And it seems to be very late at night, and they're not conversing together. This guy might be ordering something, but they're all sort of isolated and lonely, even though they live in a city. And this, structurally has a lot of wonderful things happening. He uses these big geometric shapes. He uses this high contrast. He uses contrasting colors of red and green. Um, but even though it seems so full with the structural elements, you see the figures are very sort of lonely, and that was kind of his thing. And of course, this is a very famous painting. It's been spoofed in many different ways. It's an icon, really. And I love this new one here. This is social distancing at the cafe. They can't sit together inside the cafe. They have to be outside 6 feet apart. And this was Hopper's thing. These aren't in your textbook, but he did, often show people in cities not participating in anything lively or dynamic. They're, isolated in places of the cities. And eventually he actually moves up to um, Massachusetts. He's from Massachusetts. He moves back to Massachusetts and Maine, and he paints more landscapes towards, when he's older. He gets sick of all this isolation in the city. Well, after the Depression, or as a result of the Depression, we do see artists, in the Midwest mostly, getting these commissions to go out and paint things, murals and whatnot of their own places. The biggest regionalist, we're going to call them, is Grant Wood. Um, and these artists are not enticed by the modern city that everybody seems to be flocking to. They call for a new movement of art in the Midwest. They want to turn away from European developments and city life and find subjects instead in the rural life of America, which they consider to be the backbone of American culture. And Grant Wood even writes a pamphlet called Revolt Against the City, where he calls for the varying personalities of regions to develop. Um, to be developed by local artists. And the question that always comes up with Grant Wood, with his little manifesto there, is, is he calling for this idea of nationalism? Remember, this is, after, um, you know, the world wars, where uh, lots has gone bad against people rising with nationalism. So he kind of walks a fine line with what he's calling. But really, one thing he's trying to go against isn't necessarily other nationalities. It's this idea of European art and culture coming to this country. He thinks America should have its own style, its own art. And so this is in direct contrast to the things we've been seeing develop in Europe. This seems to be taking a giant leap backwards. This is by far one of the most famous American paintings, other than Nighthawks, American Gothic. And here we see what seems to be, a sturdy, hardworking farmer with his pitchfork, and supposedly his sort of older spinster daughter. And they look like, very stern, hardworking Midwesterners in their very simple clothing. And they stand in front of a building the domestic building that has a pointed arch, which is an architectural element from the Gothic age in Europe. In America, it's called Carpenter Gothic. And of course, the pointed arch was reserved mostly for cathedrals. So we might, consider this to be a reminder of the church. These are hardworking, God-fearing Americans. But in reality, if you read the textbook, you know that this man is actually Grant Wood's dentist, and the role of the daughter is being played by Grant Wood's sister. They are not married at all. So they're actors for this painting. The whole thing is staged. Sorry if I ruined your day by telling you this great American painting is actually kind of a lie. Um, but nonetheless, he's trying to create this sense of decency and God-fearing people in the Midwest. Thomas Hart Benton also working in the Midwest. He's working in Missouri. Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood have both gone to Paris to study. Grant Wood studied in Kansas and Paris, and Benton actually studies in Paris and goes to the Chicago Art Institute for his schooling. Um, and this is a section of a giant fresco in the state capital of Jefferson City, Missouri. So this, you can see this corner here, it goes on. And this part is called Pioneer Days and Early Settlers. And you can see the scale of this thing. He's painting every inch of the whole thing. So we have this Missouri man. He's bartering with this Native American. He's giving him whiskey to get fur. We see people, coming to settle into Missouri. We see here is this detail is a scene from Huckleberry Finn, which was a very popular book at the time. And we see Missouri has, the river. So we have the steamboat. We have the church with the God-fearing people. We have the people actually building Missouri. So he's telling the tale of, the hardworking people of the Midwest. Um, and this is just one section. The other thing about especially Benton, Grant Wood had called for this too in his pamphlet, that it should be a critical eye. It should not just be, um, you know, uh, a dedication to America. It should be pointing out the good and the bad as well. So around the corner here, there's actually a lynching that is shown and other, terrible atrocities that would have happened along the way to Missouri becoming Missouri. So he turns a quick eye to everything, the progress, and then all the things that happen to progress in air quotes. Um, but the other thing about Benton is he has a very, very unique style. He has been to Paris and probably, went to Italy on a trip or something to study the figure. You can see that he knows what he's doing as far as showing like the anatomy, but he does have very elongated, almost mannerist. If you remember that Pontormo, El Greco, the very elongated figures. That he uses. He has an incredibly unique style, and you can see that in these other works of art that he has. These aren't in your textbook, but everything seems to be moving and composed in a way to create all of these sort of like, um, you know, sinuous curves that move you around these works of art. Um, and Thomas Hart Benton will actually be the teacher of Jackson Pollock, and we'll revisit this in the next chapter. So the two regionalists that we cover, there are more. There's John Courier, as in your book, I believe, but we're only going to look at Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton. Um, but the other thing, even though the regionalists think that they are going to make, uniquely American art, most of the artists have been trained in Europe, like everybody else, and some of the Harlem Renaissance artists have been as well. So. Um, we have in my mind, this is really the first real American art, even though it has a strong influence of other things. Um, Lots of people pinpoint abstract expressionism as like that will be the first American art style that happens in this country. So in Harlem, New York, remember Harlem, New York is named after uh, used to be New Amsterdam. New York used to be New Amsterdam. It used to be, Dutch run. So Harlem in the north of New York City, a borough. Um, in that borough, African American artists are promoting and celebrating their cultural accomplishments and identities of African Americans. And it's not just a visual art movement; it's a lots of writers, musicians, and of course visual artists, which is what we'll look at. Um, and lots of these, especially the writers like Langston Hughes, um, and the musicians. Harlem's still a great place for music as well. So, whoops, let's go back to oh no, got this one. Aaron Douglas is he was a writer and also a visual artist, and he had studied in Nebraska and Paris, and eventually comes to New York City and helps to start the Harlem Renaissance. He's a writer, friends with writers, and so they're all. It's almost like the Impressionists at the cafes. They're coming up with a purposeful solution to. Um, how to create a style that will be reflective of the African American experience and be uniquely American. Um, this one in your book from Aaron Douglas is This is Noah's Ark, and it's a part of a series of illustrations he did um, based on the sermons of Wilton Johnson. And, he's been to Paris and Picasso has been to the United States, at least in the Armory show. And so he's most likely studied Cubism. And you can see here by, the reduced palette and all these fractured planes that he has seen analytic Cubism from either Braque or Picasso. Um, and he said outright he was influenced by that. And we also have some kind of expressionistic things happening, and he also uses African masks like Picasso had. And so even though this is Noah's Ark, we see, it's very dynamic, right? We have all this lightning, the storm is coming, and we have the two and two. That's the story. Um, and Aaron Douglas liked to use silhouettes for everything. So playing with negative and positive spaces. And this is Douglas's giant mural in the New York City Library, which we'll also see. The next artist has a whole series that was made for that. This is from Slavery Through Reconstruction, from Aspects of Negro Life, which is the whole mural. And this part of the mural is called From Slavery Through Reconstruction. So he's working for the same, programs that the regionalists were working for after the Depression. And we see that the proclamation here is held up, and it's a focal point of these concentric rings here. Um, and the central man with his concentric rings is holding up a voting ballot, and he's also pointing to the Capitol. The right to vote is they're celebrating that during the Reconstruction. Um, but like the regionalists or Thomas R. Benton, he's pointing out some of the things that happened. These are the Confederate soldiers, you know, after the war, marching away, but to fill that void, incoming in these, sort of terrifying silhouettes here are, KKK members on their horses. Um, so he's pointing out, even though this thing has happened and we got this, that these atrocities continue. Um, but you can see he also has this thing about music, even though he's showing some pretty horrific events, some positive things as well, of course. Um, he hung out with musicians, and he not like Kandinsky trying to make it look like music, but his work is also very rhythmic with all these circles and this movement, and it's like people are dancing, and you see the blowing of the horns here. Um, and most of his work after his sort of cubist phase turns into more lyrical in a way. Another artist working at the Harlem Renaissance is Jacob Lawrence, who did a giant series of paintings, it's 60 paintings that document the African American experience, life in the North. And this is, he went to the New York Public Library to sort of study art and to study all kinds of things. So in this one, he's showing, the progress of, he shows the whole migration series, like from south to north, and how all the conditions are for people to get from one place to another. And in this scene, he's showing that even though they have arrived, you can see that there is a rope separating the two races, and that there is, there's still discrimination. It's not like you've arrived at, some wonderful open arms to, give you all your rights. You are segregated. Um, Another muralist that worked, he actually worked in this country as well. He's had several murals put there's one in Detroit, there's one in Kansas City, but this one is in Mexico. This is Diego Rivera, who's probably one of the more famous Mexican artists of this time period. And this is a mural, much like the Thomas R. Benton, showing the history of a place. And this is in the National Palace of Mexico City. And you can see, all the symbols, Aztec symbols, and whatnot that he shows. But really, um, we're going to look at somebody who might be more famous than him, and that is his wife, or was his wife. This is Diego Rivera himself. He was larger than life in life, and this is his wife, Frida Kahlo. They make a very odd couple, and if you've seen the movie on Frida or any documentaries on her, they had a very strange marriage as well, horrible marriage actually. So this is the art of Frida Kahlo. This is called the Two Fridas. Frida is has a Mexican mother and a German father, and she was in a terrible car accident when she was younger, and she never really was out of pain after that. She had many, many surgeries, and she just seemed to be in a devastating amount of pain most of her life. Um, she painted like her husband, and this is what her art looks like. This one here, the Two Fridas, is showing her two heritages. We have the very traditional Mexican outfit here, and we have a more European outfit over here, almost a German, like an antique German dress in a way. Um, and we have the heart, which looks, might be about her, her pain, her surgeries. She's actually holding, the scissors here that she's cut the the vein herself. She holds a tiny little locket with a picture of Diego, her husband, on it. So it is a reference to like all her personal lives and her heritage, but also it's about her heritage of her Mexican identity, and she was very much a nationalist, as was her husband, who was more of a communist. Um, so the odd thing about Frida Kahlo is she always denied that she was a surrealist at all. Um, Hopefully, you can see that she has, much affinity with something like Salvador Dali or Rene Magritte would do. Her artwork is, deeply personal, but it's not out of the question that this is sort of like a dreamlike world or a nightmare world. And then this is just more of her stuff. When I see this, I think, how can she possibly deny that she's a surrealist? I mean, this is something Salvador Dali would do. And she made a lot of her artwork, of course, has her portrait in it, which makes her, a very, she's iconic herself, her image, not just her artwork. Photography at this time, we saw lots of developments in past chapters. I feel like photography really comes into its own at this time. Photographers are finding a way to make um, the photograph more competitive with fine arts. Remember, with the Impressionists didn't know what to do with it, and neither did the photographers. Is it photojournalism? Is it a document? Is it art? Um, and there's been a struggle with it, and I feel like it's at this point artists come up with a way to make the photograph an art form of its own. So Stieglitz is a very influential artist in this time period. He starts a gallery. He actually shows uh, George O'Keeffe and other artists, New York artists at the time. Um, Before the depression, of course, that he goes under. Um, this is his photograph, The Steerage, and this is showing uh, a boat being loaded up to go to Europe, and you can see all these wealthy people up here, not all wealthy, but below are people who are being deported. These are people who were not let into the country, they're being sent back, and that is what the steerage is. That's where these people are sitting. So it's a commentary on the haves and have-nots, but you can see compositionally that it is broken up with this diagonal right in the center, and then we have this sort of loopy movement with the chains, and then we have this cross diagonal, sort of bringing us back down to these people. So formally, it is very composed. Edward Weston is one of the first artists to, or photographers, artists to um, really experiment with the idea of form in photography. Now, you might not even know what these are when you first look at them. Of course, he does name them for you so you can tell. Pepper number 30, and he did do many pictures of peppers. Um, and hopefully you can see that, this is just like Rodin's The Kiss in my mind, this pepper on the left. But pepper number 30 over here, it's very similar to whatever, a Bernini sculpture or something. We have this, circular movement. Apollo and Daphne, perhaps. They seem to be dancing together. And you can tell he does a silver gelatin print, which is a newer thing, to give it this slick sort of highlights, and then to get all this texture of the pepper. Check him out if you like photography. He's got some really interesting things. Your textbook also has his human forms that look like they're sand dunes. It's just like very clever. Dorothy Lang actually worked for the Works Progress Administration. One of these artists who got money to go out and photograph in California, and she goes out and she finds the migrant mother, um, uh, people going from farm to farm trying to find work, in the Dust Bowl, where the drought is so bad that everybody is out of work. And you see this mother here; she's holding her baby, her sleeping baby, and her two children are hiding their faces. The story is that Dorothy Lang asked this woman if she could take her photograph, and the children didn't want to be in it, so they're hiding their faces. And it seems like um, it was just like the perfect timing of this situation. This is just an iconic photograph about the Depression. As a matter of fact, when John Steinbeck, the writer, saw this, he based his whole book, The Grapes of Wrath, on this photograph. It's about the migration and the Dust Bowl of California. Man Ray is an artist that is attuned with Dada, surrealism, and other like almost like ready-mades here. He actually was a photographer, and he made a lot of experimental like photo montages and things. This is his famous photograph of Picasso, and this is Man Ray himself with a very young Salvador Dali. And he did photograph many actresses and things, but he has a very unique style. He also made some sculpture, not a lot, and this is his famous sculpture, which he called the Gift. Cadeau is gift in French, um, and hopefully you can see it's an old timey iron, and with these nails stuck to it or tacks stuck to it. There's no way you can iron a shirt with that. That's uh, you know a gift you wouldn't give to somebody, for Mother's Day, hopefully. So it's very much like Dada, but I always think it's more like Henri Magritte because it kind of has this ironic sense of humor to it. Also in sculpture at this time is Alexander Calder, who came to claim because he creates these things called mobiles. And if you have children, if you were a child with a crib, you probably know what this is. He actually created these. Peggy Guggenheim, who is a very wealthy woman, decides to make her own museum. Now, it's not a state museum, like you remember the Louvre is a state museum in Paris. It used to be the palace of Louis XIV. Um, we have the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a state museum. The Guggenheim Museum is a privately funded museum right in the center of New York City. Um, and she befriends Calder and asks him to make a sculpture, and he comes up with this idea of a mobile that will hang over the entranceway, if you want to call it that, above the whole atrium that is in the center of the Guggenheim. And he comes up with this, wire and metal sculpture that moves, and kinetic sculpture moves. And so mobiles are run by, they're not motorized, they move by whatever wind is hitting them. So, one thing that um, the Guggenheim and many other museums have calders in their atriums. They have to really control the way the air conditioning runs because they don't want these things to go too fast. You want them to sort of gently move at a very, very slow rate because of insurance and whatnot. But you can see when it's against something that it can cast a shadow, it creates like a whole other depth of art. And, he has like a whimsical way about him. He's not like an overtly serious artist. In fact, he's incredibly playful. And, these are brilliant. This is why they were adapted to like childhood toys. Um, and just to show you more, those were mobiles. He also made what's called stabiles, and these are all over the country. This is one in Chicago here. This is in a museum here. And you can see they're like these amorphic creatures. They're kind of surreal and abstract put together. And then I just included this because I adore Calder, honestly. He works in just simple wire sometimes, or used to. Um, he created this thing called a circus, a wire circus, and he made all the figures just out of wire. And he would go out around and perform tricks and things like that. They would, be on the trapeze or the high wire or whatever. And he would just literally, as an older guy, like get down on the ground and play with these things as a performance. So he did performance art. And one time he arrived at a place and they said, well, let's get your boxes and things. Where's the circus? And he pulled out a giant roll of wire and said, I'm going to make it. And he made it on the spot, and that was part of the performance. So he mostly crushed these after he made them or sold them to people. So he's just a great like whimsical artist, but his mobiles are all over, and so are his giant outdoor stables. Another sculptor working at this time is Giacometti. This is his man, Pointing number 5, he makes these gigantic, you can see it's almost 6 feet tall, bronze sculptures. So figurative sculpture, but you can see obviously he's playing with this idea of proportions. It's very mannerist in its proportions with this elongation. Um, and these are more of his figures walking. You can see how big they are in this one. And there's some sort of he has similarities to maybe Hopper, where his figures seem isolated, and maybe depressed. Um, but it's also whimsical in a way. And if you ever get a chance, if you like drawing, he's a fantastic person to study for how to go about making a drawing. He liked to repeat lines over and over again, almost like a wire sculpture, his drawing style. You can see all his drawings here. This isn't one of his shows, drawings and paintings, multimedia. Wrapping up soon. We have architecture. Well, of course, there's lots of architecture in New York City to look at, but we're just going to focus on this one here during this time because it's probably one of the more famous buildings. Sort of reflects the idea of Art Deco and architecture happening at this time. And this is built by Chrysler, and it is the sort of like a great monument to a prosperous industrial nation. Um, and you can see this is the Art Deco, these repeating fans and all of these triangles, like crowns almost light up at night. I mean, it's just a fabulous building. When you have an aerial shot, you can see like these are all bronze, the glistening, and all these gargoyles here around the edges. I mean, it's just fantastic. Um, And you can see it's in 1928, it's built as a great monument to a prosperous nation. And you know that in 1929 is the stock market in New York City crashed. So I'd like to put this in here. These are actually guys working on the Chrysler building. Um, Whoever signed up for that job must be insane. And we don't see a lot of domestic architecture in this course. As a matter of fact, this might be the last of it. Um, but this is a very famous American architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. This is his Roby House in Chicago. I actually used to live down the street from this house. It was under construction for many years, but now it's open again, and you can go in and see the whole thing. And you can see that it has these wide, long, horizontal bands just sort of stacked up. Frank Lloyd Wright was influenced by Japanese architecture. Japanese often have these cantilevered horizontal planes. Um, they also have this sort of indoor outdoor thing. Now, these are things that are common to us now. We know these sayings. If you watch House Hunters or anything on HGTV, you understand the idea of open concept, indoor outdoor living. Um, etc., like outdoor spaces. He invented this pretty much. He brought this whole thing to domestic architecture in the United States. He considered it to be organic architecture on a very human scale. Um, and he's had movies made about him too. He's very famous. He studied with Louis Sullivan, who was in our last chapter in Chicago as well. He studied with him and he worked with him. Um, so they had a falling out. Like many artists, Frank Lloyd Wright had a temper. Um, and so he kind of the idea of a picture window, if you have one of those in your house, a picture window, like giant windows, he came up with all these domestic concepts that we still use. This is his famous building called Falling Water. Um, in Pennsylvania, you can go see this building too. It's still open. Um, and you can see that it's actually built over a waterfall. He finds this is organic architecture. You take into consideration the landscape. You don't superimpose the building, you work with the landscape itself. It's almost like ancient Egypt or something. And of course, it has the outdoor um, living kind of thing happening. It has open concept, etc. All right. Well, that's it for now. I will make the last chapter video next week. Thank you.